A warm welcome to everybody from the southwest of France. We're all over the world, we seem to be on these calls. It's Wednesday evening, so it must be the time for the network webinar. Sorry, I just had something strange coming up on my screen. So it's a great pleasure to welcome Bob Hesse as our speaker this evening. We met in the Science of Consciousness Conference in Interlaken in July of 2019, where he was giving a presentation, and we were presenting the Galileo Commission on a poster. And we got talking after his talk, because obviously, as you can see from this evening, and what he's going to be talking about is very much in the central interest of consciousness, near-death experiences, mystical experiences, which are the essential focuses of the network. And so, as you may have seen from the biography, Bob is a permanent Catholic deacon who's president of the Contemplative Network, and you can see that on his slide. And he's dedicated to interdenominational Christian contemplative prayer, teaching, scientific research, and interfaith dialogue. And he was inspired by Thomas Merton, who I've also been very inspired by, and also Thomas Keating, who died not that long ago. And unfortunately, we never managed to get Thomas Keating to Mystics and Scientists. So that's regrettable. And he's also connected with the Texas Medical Center with his interest in spirituality and health, and with degrees in faith and in science. And so he's very much comes from an interdisciplinary perspective, and it's a great pleasure for us to have him this evening on neural and anatomical correlates, comparing memories of NDE and mystical experiences. Over to you, Bob.
David, thank you very much, and thank you for everyone joining, and I hope to make this interesting and at everybody's level, not that I'm going to be above or below. I'd like to start with the fact that the main neuroscientist behind this is Calixto Machado, and we're going to have this presentation in 4 sections. I'll give a break slide between each section so you know when I'm switching from background to objective, to research, and to conclusions. First, I'll give some background and how this research happened to come about, but I first have to go through some terminology. Obviously, everyone here knows what NDE is, but we coined the term spiritual contemplative experience because I felt there was a need for that kind of a term to describe mystical experiences that were not connected with near death. And so I'm saying it's synonymous with mystical experiences and not the same as out of body. Out of body is common quite often to both. And how I got started in this is I started to attend and give presentations at various conferences. And I want to go through this because it relates to why we did the research. There are 2 basic. There's philosophical, non-theistic, and religious theistic conferences. The first was an invitation that the Dalai Lama made to Father Thomas Keating, my mentor, and Keating asked me to go be an advanced mat at the Minded Life Institute conference. And clearly, they have done a lot of research on Richie Davidson, et cetera, have done research on meditation. Everybody knows about that, but the Buddhists have done a lot of that way in advance of anybody else. Then I attended a conference in Cuba on the brain, death, and disorders of consciousness, which is kind of related, but more related to bringing people out of coma and the medical side of it. And I met an individual there, in fact, Calixto Machado. I'll talk about that later. Then I was involved and gave presentations at the Conference on Medicine and Religion, which is Harvard University of Chicago Institute for Spirituality and Health, which I was vice chairman of, and I'm still in the faculty of. And then the European Conference on Religion, Spirituality, and Health, which is basically the European version of the CMR. But what was interesting about these conferences is there was essentially no cross-fertilization between the conferences. Now, that was not necessarily true of the 2 religious conferences, but I was a bit stunned about that, and I kind of knew it because I was only running into myself. I didn't see many other people I recognized. Now, that last one, the religious one, was really draws on research, medical research, and I would say the most important book on that subject has been the Handbook of Religion and Health, edited by Harold Koenig. And this is really a synopsis of all the research of various forms, okay? And it takes the research in that area, it takes in three sections. It's basically, if you have a faith belief, a theistic faith belief, there's been a lot of medical research done on that. Not much on spirituality, because spirituality can't be quantified. So the research was done basically on interviewing people on their faith belief. And this particular research that is in the box showed an increase of well-being if you had a faith belief. Church attendance regularly led to a longer lifespan of as much as 7 years. And prayer practice and the effect on the brain of prayer. This particular research project to the right was one I was involved with the Baylor College of Medicine in Houston, and showed a link between less and depression. So this led me to want to look more at the prayer types and how much research had been done other than just the Buddhists and the Tibetan Buddhists, which they've done a lot. So, all faiths share two types of prayer: discursive, which is cataphatic in Greek, which is really guided meditation, and the other is contemplative, apophatic. And centering prayer is a prayer practice that I learned with Keating, Father Keating, who was my mentor. And because of that, I learned to teach it. And that quite often will open the vestibule to an experience of contemplative prayer or mystical prayer, or even a spiritual contemplative experience. What's interesting about the nomenclature is that meditation is really means, the etymology of the word means to engage the imagination. Contemplation is really focused prayer, like on a mantra. But the term meditation has been kind of bastardized to mean both of these, one and two, but it's really not in the historical sense. Now, when I teach centering prayer, I wanted to tell you kind of very quickly how I do it so it relates to the research. We choose a sacred word or image as our intention to be with God. We sit in a comfortable position for 20 minutes with our eyes closed, no interruptions. And then every time, and this is the key part, every time we become aware of our thoughts or become aware we're engaging with our thoughts, we ever so gently return to our sacred word. Now that could be an image, a word, it could be our breath, but the important key difference in the theistic approach is that it is a symbol of your desire to be with God. Basically, you're desiring to be with God even more than being with your own thoughts. And then there's a gentle readjustment and return after 20 minutes. We don't get up and do a jig, okay? So then the idea was, how did this research come about? Well, when I was teaching centering prayer, I would run it, I've taught it maybe thousands, and I've seen the unconscious unloading to the conscious brain. The iceberg floating in the ocean is kind of a symbol of how much of our brain is unconscious and how much is conscious. The conscious is above the water, 95% is below. And in the centering prayer practice, I've seen this unloading process take place. After it's over with, we talk about it, the participants. And I was teaching 10 people in Houston. And at the end of this 20-minute sit, which was their first ever, 3 of them started to retell how they had just relived an earlier near-death experience. I must tell you, I was stunned. I was a fly on the wall listening, and they relived it to the same full extent that they lived it when they had a near-death experience. And I took a mental note of this and carried it with me. Then I was invited to give presentation at the Disorders of Consciousness Conference in Cuba, which is actually a very international conference. And I met Calixto Machado, who's one of the world's experts in bringing people out of coma. And we talked about, and it basically was an opportunity. I put together a team to take down there And it was the first time that religion had been presented to a university setting down there since the revolution. Then I was asked by Calixto if I would do a breakout session and teach centering prayer. And I said, well, I don't know, is that appropriate here? It's an atheistic country. I mean, what do you want me to do? And he said, just go ahead and do it. So I did, and his daughter gathered all of her neuroscience friends together, and they attended. And at the end of a 20-minute set, she started to proceed to tell about her profound near-death experience, profound mystical experience that she had during that prayer practice. I've seen this happen about 5% of the time at varying degrees. What made me connect the two experiences, number 2 experience and number 4, it dawned on me that Dr. Machado has access to a lot of people who have been brought back out of coma. I asked him, have you had many talk about near-death experiences? And he said, oh, all the time. Well, as it turns out, the conference was in English, but I invited a friend of mine, Father Walker, who's an American and probably one of the few Americans that's lived in Cuba for any length of time. And he used to be the chairman of Contemplative Outreach, which was founded by Keating and 2 other Trappist monks. Well, he lives in Havana. And I didn't want to risk language translations, because I don't speak Spanish, when teaching the prayer. So he came in and taught the prayer. And that's when Calixto's daughter had the experience. She went back and told her father about the experience. And then I realized that Father Walker would have access to those who have had mystical experiences, because normally people won't talk about them when they've had them. But they would talk to somebody who's taught them the practice. I called him, and sure enough, he said, oh, I've got a number of people that have told me about it. Suddenly, the synchronistic availability of these 2 databases, or I shouldn't say databases, subjects, came to the fore. So thus was the research born. The objective was then to think about this as transcendent consciousness. And I made a mental note when I look back at this that NDE and SCE both had 4 attributes that were measured by the Grayson scale that were common. One is paranormal, out of body for NDE, and SCE is there's an ecstasy, a spaceless feeling, cognitive timelessness in NDE, and a sense of the prayer lasting very short time when it was actually a very long time, an effective sense of peace, and a wholeness, a sense of perfection, and a transcendent divine spiritual sense in NDE, and the same is true of SCE, a sense of oneness to the universe. And this symbol is indicative of all the religions experiencing sense of oneness in their practice. So what were the motivations for the research? Well, that previous slide, I showed all the religions having this sense of oneness when they practice their form of contemplative prayer. 87% of religious believe in 87% of the population believes in a transcendent life and a transcendence into a next life. So this would be important in 87% of the population. Interfaiths have described SCE and NDE for centuries. Conferences need cross-fertilization for benefits, and I saw that. Medicine debates the bioethics of defining death. People have reported reliving NDE and SCE, and I saw that myself, which stunned me. And neuroscientists seek consciousness neurocorrelates. And science recognizes similar NDE and SCE attributes. So what was the objective? The goal was to compare neural and anatomical correlates of remembering NDE and SCE. Uniqueness, first-time direct neural comparison has been made between the two. Now, there may have been, but I didn't find it, and in the way we've approached this. And somebody out there, you can tell me if I'm all wet, but I think this is kind of unique. So the results are hopefully will shed light on the motivations for the study. So that was our objective. We had a number of committed researchers, including Harold Koenig, the editor of that magazine, Andrew Newberg, who's done brain scans of Catholic nuns that were practicing centered prayer. Ramiro Salas, the researcher at Baylor College of Medicine, but the main neuroscientist was Calixto Machado. And his daughter, Janine Machado, is also a neuroscientist. Now I'm going to switch to the research. What was the protocol? Well, we had study subjects, 5 NDE and 5 SCE, confirmed by the Grayson scale. Did neurological exam, CAT scan, and MRI to eliminate subjects with brain damage. We went to a resting state to establish a baseline for evaluation. We did a guided meditation to standardize, it was in a standardized approach to facilitate the remembering process. So once we got to that remembering process, and the guided meditation went into silence and let the person remember. And what was interesting is that the memory tests, both number 4 and number 5, we were talking about remembering. What I was not convinced about until Calixto Machado convinced me, because I'm not a neuroscientist, was, well, Calixto, you're not capturing this people when they actually have it. I mean, it's impossible to catch them. How are we going to do that? He says, all you got to do is get them to remember it. It's the basis of PTSD. It's the basis of a lot of problems neurologically. And he said, it's pretty well accepted that the remembering process can capture to a great extent. So when they were actually in the memory state, the memory tests, we did neural scans and anatomical assessments for both NDE and SCE, okay? The research subjects, this is a background on who they, basically their background. I'm not going to go into the detail other than to point out that there were 5 of each, and that they were, and the Grayson scale was applied. And obviously the NDE had more issues because they went through a dying process. Research phases. Now, when we started this research, we wanted a snapshot neural evaluation. We chose the tool of QEEGT. Now, I'm going to explain how we got to that tool. But the first research was done for this, and we didn't think past our belly button, basically. This was the first research. It was reported in Switzerland. And then only later did we decide, well, we need to go to a second phase. We need continuous neural, and we chose continuous EEG. And then we needed continuous anatomical, which we abbreviated continuous AA. So this presentation is going to cover all 3 of these. The chosen tool, we wanted a tool for the first phase, had good spatial ability and temporal ability. In other words, a tool to be able to find out where in the brain it was happening and the speed at which it was happening. Well, you want something that's going to combine the best of both of those X and Y axes. This doesn't cut it. That doesn't quite cut it. This is kind of low definition. We chose QEEG, which is quantitative electroencephalogram tomography. And there's a method for applying that, Loretta method, which is best used for pathophysiological brain mechanisms involved in NDE and SCE, because it combines EEG timing with MRI spatial. Basically, it's combining this with that. Now, this was chosen by Calixto, and he's very familiar with this in people coming back from dying. In fact, he discovered a new state of consciousness that he reported here in Houston in his process of trying to bring people back from unconscious states. Now I'm not going to go through all these in super detail, but I will tell you we did the QEEGT in different frequencies. This is the alpha frequency, and this is a 3D reconstruction, if you will, of the scans, so we don't go through data lines. And it showed an increased inactivation for both NDE and SCE that was similar, but it was greater for SCE. We did it in the gamma range frequency. And all NDE and SCE subjects he showed parietal occipital activation extending to the temporal regions, but it was greater in SCE. So you can tell the color is more intense in the SCE compared to the NDE, but compared to the baseline, they were both the same, but that's where we moved to. So there was definitely a similarity between NDE and SCE, but more seriously engaged in the NCE. Delta frequency, we didn't compare delta to the baseline, we just compared it to the two, and there was an increased activation for both NDE and SCE in both the right and left temporal lobes, while greater in right hemisphere, yet overall greater for the SCE. Now I'm going through the data. I haven't, we're not going to draw conclusions right away. We did it for the frontal lobes, increased activation for NDE and SCE in frontal lobes. It was greater for SCE. Same phenomenon's happening. Now we went to the continuous neural, CEEG. First, we did separate hemispheres, and this is a grand average for all subjects for separate hemispheres. SCE showed a greater activation compared with NDE. So you can see the lines here are much higher than for NDE, but the duration period, which is starting from here to here, is the same. I mean, there's definitely a correlation. Combined hemispheres, grand average of all subjects for both hemispheres shows increments of amplitude correlation between NDE and SCE remembering time, but increased again was greater with SCE. So it's still showing more intensity for SCE. Frontal leads, the CEG grand average for all subjects in both hemispheres. SCE had greater activation compared to with NDE. Now the activation intensity is the number of lines, not their amplitude. So there's definitely correlation taking place. Alpha and gamma, CEG frontal lobes grand average for all subjects in both hemispheres. SCE had greater activation compared to NDE. Again, same thing. And over the same duration. You can see there's nothing happening here until they remember, and then the remembering stops. So there's a correlation in the middle. Now we went to continuous anatomic assessment. What we assessed was heart rate and heart rate variability. Now the heart rate variability is variation in time interval between consecutive heartbeats. And the methods that were used were standard deviation of normal to normal intervals of heart rate, root square of successive differences. So that's what it was plotted, basically. Now, here's where it gets interesting. And there's a curve in this whole research that I didn't expect. And it's understandable, but I didn't expect it. SCE peaceful. Everybody reported, all the SCE patients reported and subjects reported a peaceful experience in their remembering process. And there was a significant decrease in heart rate and increase in heart rate variability measured by SDN and RMS-SD. All subjects reported a sense of peace. So this is consistent. The heart rate goes up in the difference in the heartbeats, according to Calixto, is very typical of a peaceful state. NDE peaceful. There were only 2 NDE subjects that reported peaceful NDE, and I abbreviated that with a P NDE just so I could keep my head straight here. With significant decrease in heart rate and increase in heart rate variability. And this correlated very well with the SCE peaceful experience that people had. Now there's the NDE anxious heart rate. 3 of the 5 NDE subjects reported anxious NDE, and I say A NDE, with an increase in heart rate and decrease in heart rate variability. Their heart is pumping away. They're anxious. They're nervous in the remembering process. So we've been through the 3 phases of the research. And what are the conclusions? Well, the primary conclusions, and these are preliminary conclusions, okay? Because and I'll get into it why. There was a significant QEEGT and CEEG neurocorrelation across broad frequency ranges and Grayson scales between NDE and SCE. High correlation. Higher neural for SCE consistent with the fact the subject was not dying. So we attributed the higher ratings on the SCE to the fact that the patient was going through a pleasant experience all the way through. There was no dying process. the significant emotional correlation between SCE and PDE was significant. The normal SCE and the pleasurable NDE was significant. There was no correlation between the anxious NDE and the SCE. This is consistent with the memory of more painful cause of dying. It's basically a struggle of what memory are they remembering exactly in NDE. And here's what was confusing. When we applied the Grayson scale at phase 1, we got correlation. Then when we saw this difference with the pleasant and an unpleasant NDE, we went back to the subjects, and they started to recognize that during that remembering period, even though they gave us different QEEG results and different CEEG results, the Grayson scale, one of them started to want to change it. And what was happening, we believe, is they had conflicting memories between painful dying and pain-free out of body. And this is actually reported in the literature that when you interview people that they've had a bad NDE experience, quite often see because they were at a pleasurable place. And from what I've read, it's very often a pleasurable place. And then when they're being asked to come back, they don't want to, and that makes them anxious because they went through a painful process to get there. So what were the limitations on this research? And these are the limitations. Even though Calixto convinced me otherwise, he admits and I admit that there's never a certainty that the event is the same as a remembering. The other criticism that's been leveled at this research is that the control state was remembering just a resting state. It wasn't remembering anything like peeling a banana, okay? And that's been a criticism. And the other is the obvious, and that's there aren't many subjects. That's why all of this research is preliminary. Well, what are some of the highlights of each of these phases? Well, this is the quantitative EEG measured across a broad spectrum of wavelengths. What do these different wavelengths imply in neuroscience? Gamma implies increased cognitive activity. So there was a correlation between the two states, NDE and SCE, in a cognitive activity, alpha, greater concentration, delta indicative of an inhibited sensory perception of the body in favor of internally directed cognition, internal mentation. In other words, basically, in this wavelength, it's indicative of out-of-body experience, if you will. That would be not a surprise. And then the frontal lobe activations implied greater attentiveness and cognitive function. Now, I have to tell you, I've dealt with a lot of people who've died and were dying, and quite often they will come and become much more cognitive toward the end. It's a strange thing to observe, and I've observed it in my dealings. And this kind of implies that. The CEEG measured amplitude increases in activation intensity, increases similar between NDE and SCE. The increases are greater in gamma, cognition, and alpha concentration. In other words, those wavelengths that are tied to cognition and concentration. Increases greater for SCE, which is not quite of a surprise. Greater activation for SCE with frontal lobes of both hemispheres, indicating greater attentiveness and an increment of cognitive function. So I hope you're getting a flavor for what we were running into here. The autonomic assessment measured by SDA and RMSD were the heart rates and heart rate variability. NDE subjects feeling peace had a significant decrement of heart rate and increment of heart rate variability. Well, those were only 2 subjects. All SCE subjects felt peace and had significant decrement of heart rate and increment of heart rate variability. NDE subjects feeling anxious had a significant increment of heart rate and decrement of heart rate variability. So that's what I said before. It's just kind of getting the highlights one more time. Now, I don't like to just stop at that. I like to kind of visualize out in the future. Where are we headed? What's going on here? Why are we interested in these transcendent states? Because I'm one of the 87% of the population, okay? And what are these transcendent events that we're talking about? Well, NDE, Moody described this first, as you know, in 1975, and Bruce Grayson's scale added to it. SCE was described by William James even earlier in the varieties of religious experience. Those are transcendent events, in my view. That's where we're transcending between this world and the next. Is there another transcendent event? Singularity of the Big Bang is another transcendent event. Einstein's theories led to singularity attributes of the Big Bang. This is what I think is extremely fascinating. The attributes are similar for all three, and they shouldn't be a surprise, because if they're really transcendent events between this world and the next, they should be. Paranormal, out-of-body, spaceless, we covered those before. There is no dimension at the non-material singularity. Cognitive timelessness, timeless short prayer. Timeless, there's no light at the singularity. There's no time. Affective peace, wholeness, perfection. Everything's ordered at the singularity. It's zero entropy. There's a transcendent, divine, religious, transcendent feeling that NDE has given people. There's a oneness. Well, there are unified four forces. Now, Einstein only knew two at the time, but now four forces. Isn't this interesting that those three transcendent states, we didn't research the third because I don't know how you'd do it anyway, but I find that the fact that there are four attributes that are shared by all of these is fascinating. So this sense of oneness that people talk about with the universe when they're discussing these issues, I just kind of pictorially try to capture here, because there is something going on and we don't know. Scientists don't know, but there's something going on here and we need to look deeper at it with the tools at least we have now and try to extend ourselves out. And so what's the path forward? Well, I think there's an encouragement here to expand the studies for more subjects. That's our feeling, because we don't have enough subjects. And we can get our hands on more, but like you would expect, money is an issue and getting financing for it is an issue. I was very fortunate because in Cuba, things were less expensive, and I was able to do this with private financing to get the financing to do the research. QEEGT, best for temporal and spatial, I said special, it should be spatial, sorry, resolution of complex states of consciousness. So this tool has proven itself valuable for bringing people back that are in unconscious states, but it's a valuable tool for looking at NDE and mystical experiences. I think that the application of this research, the first thing that comes to my mind as a religious deacon is palliative care and ministry, to explore the use of century prayer to lessen the fear of dying and negative near-death experiences. I think if people were taught this practice, and I've seen it happen quite often, that they experience a sense of peace, if they were told and explained to them how the process of dying can lead to the same attributes, it would relieve a lot of their angst about dying. And I think this is a practical side of this that should be explored, and that could be the incentive for further research investment. We're interested in collaborative research, interdisciplinary cooperation for future studies, because obviously this is interdisciplinary. It's not one field completely. So I hope I didn't rush through this too fast, but I wanted to do my hour, so I did.
Bob, thank you very much indeed. Perhaps you could stop sharing your screen.
Yeah.
Now you've done very well indeed, in fact, because we're definitely ahead of time. Now, Marilyn, you're quick off the block here. What's your question? You need to unmute yourself.
Not working. Yeah, now it has. Where's the speaker? Never mind. Thank you very much.
If he speaks, then you'll see him.
You'll come up again.
Yeah.
I've got a couple of comments and a couple of questions. My comments are, they were doing some animal experiments on what happens with fMRI in the brain when rats are dying. Horrible experiments, I have to say. But they found that the visual cortex lights up like crazy, and which seems to fit for me because of the experience of light. I don't know about the other senses. I talked to Peter about it, but mostly people talk about it light, not smell or taste or touch. The second thing, I've often wondered, like decades ago, people were talking about the God spot. And my scientific questions are, what does anybody think is the biological trigger and mechanism for that whooshing out into this alternative universe? And what might be the evolutionary significance, given that it has to be selected in evolution for some reason? Okay, that's all my comments and questions.
Bob.
A lot of, yeah.
I'm not sure I understand the question. Could you repeat the question part of that, please?
Well, I made a comment that the experiments with horrible experiments killing rats and doing fMRI with the rats as they die show huge activity in the visual cortex, which you didn't mention. Yeah. Secondly, I was wondering about decades ago, people used to talk about the God spot in the brain. But I think that's become obsolete or not. And finally, I'm, as a biologist, wondering what could be the biological trigger for bringing on whooshing out into an alternative parallel universe, into peace and light and et cetera, and what could be the evolutionary significance, supposing, as one might, that the NDE exists for a reason. It's selected in either by emergent happenings in the brain or whatever. So a lot of, I mean, maybe choose one thing because I've got 4 things there. Right.
Well, I don't think there's a God spot, but certainly the frontal lobes are the youngest, and they play a big role in making moral decisions. So we know that because of people whose brains have been damaged in the past. As far as the visual and what causes this departing, I don't know that science is necessarily going to ever be able to answer that, but I think we're dancing closer. And I think the fact that we are talking about these things is an indication that there is an evolutionary process taking place. I mean, I'm pretty much of a Teilhard de Chardin person who was ahead of his times. And so I think there is a spiritual dimension to this. And I think it's also technological. The fact we're doing Zoom here and we can share these things, we have a shared consciousness. So I really am a believer in the fact that there is an outside consciousness that is, and we can call that God, and we get little tastes of it once in a while. And the more we're opening ourselves up to listening, which is the listening process of prayer and meditation and contemplative prayer, the more likely we are to hear. Most people don't talk about these experiences, and I've come up with 5 reasons why they don't. Number one, the words are not able to describe the experience. Number two, the memory of the experience leaves you. And so even trying to remember, and there was a comment on the chat, it's very, very true, that you lose the memory of it as you're getting further away from it. So it's not the same to try to remember it. Number three, people think that you're a holy person. Well, that's got nothing to do with it, as far as I'm concerned. Number four, they try to get it. Well, they can't. And you don't get it. It's a gift that you open yourself up to. It's not something that you reach out and grab onto. In fact, that's the problem in the first place, is we want to grab onto stuff. Okay. And so I missed the fifth one, but anyway, there were five. So anyway, and so I don't know if I answered your question. I don't know the answer to most of your thoughts.
Well, there's things to think about.
Yeah, thank you very much. We're going on to Vasily next from Brussels. Vasily.
Hi, and thanks for the great lecture. One point that really excited me and made me very attentive, more attentive than the other part of the lecture is the role that you attribute in singularities in physics and the light. The light, that's my professional bias since I am a physicist, but and coming from an Orthodox tradition, although I'm not at all Christian, I mean, not at all good Christian, there is always in spiritual texts the distinction between the structured and unstructured light, the spiritual versus the real light. Now, and the descriptions of the unstructured light in Philokalia and St. Basil, it is described exactly like as if you read special relativity. I mean, once you become a being of light or beings of light travel instantaneously in the universe, they read the mind of everything, which presupposes an inner structure, a noetic aspects of light, which physics does not have. So your proposal is courageous and path-breaking, and I wish you could elaborate and work on that further.
I should also say, Vasily, that you and Pier Francesco have been working on this aspect of light in the NDE and light in physics. So maybe you and Bob could correspond. I can put you in touch.
I'd love to. Yes.
Bob, what's your response to that?
Well, I think it's interesting. Some people will say to me, well, what's outside the universe? And in a sense, that's a nonsensical question, because we're trapped by the dimensions of space and time. If we went one direction, we'd come back the other, we would experience no edge. Just like they thought that the edge of the earth was you're gonna fall off of it. Well, then you walk around, you never find an edge. So we're trapped in those dimensions of space and time. And I read something about the logic that the famous scientist in the wheelchair at Cambridge, Hawking, gave in his explanation for God doesn't exist. And I read his work and I thought, well, this is interesting. Let's see, what was his logic? And he said, well, at the singularity, there was no space and time, so God had no time to create the universe. Well, my attitude to that is, it's like saying to the guy who made the first Volkswagen, did he force himself to have to live inside of it? I mean, really? I mean, so the point is that we cannot get our hands around something that we can't experience. It's like asking a fish, what's it like to not have water? And the fish, if he could speak, would go, I have no idea what you're talking about. So that's the struggle, is that singularity is at that point where it transitions to no space, no time. That's the way I look at it.
Yeah, thank you very much. Bernard, Bernard is our president. You're next.
Thank you. So, Bob, thank you very much. I was very interested in your talk. My ears particularly pricked up, though, towards the end when you started talking about the singularities, because I should say I am a cosmologist, so this is in my professional domain of interest. Now, I have to say, most cosmologists would not be particularly swayed by that argument, because well, most cosmologists aren't very interested in mystical and near-death experiences. And they would say, well, a singularity is just saying there's a mystery, no one knows what happens, so it's easy to connect one mystery, what happens at the Big Bang, with another mystery, what happens when you have a near-death experience. But actually, I don't take that view, and I very much side in this matter, and I might just explain why. And this is because it seems to me that you need a sort of broader view of physics, which goes beyond normal space and time to accommodate not only the physical world, but the mental and spiritual world. And as people who've heard me spout on about this many times before will know, my own favored model is the sort of hyperspatial model where you have higher dimensions. And you need that higher dimensional realm to describe near-death experiences and various types of transpersonal experiences. At least that's the hypothesis. But the point is, within this picture, if you ask where does the universe come from at the Big Bang, it does in some sense emerge from mind, because those higher dimensions come in at that, if you like, at the Big Bang. And I should stress, this is not the mainstream cosmological view, but it's just my particular view. And so the idea that the higher realm of reality which you're encountering at the beginning of the universe is related to the higher dimensional realm encountered in mystical and near-death experiences, to me makes a lot of sense. And I have to say that I side with Hesse rather than Hawking in this, even though I'm a great admirer of Hawking, obviously. So, well, I guess that's a word of encouragement, but I might be the only cosmologist who would agree with you, but I do agree with you. And I thank you for your talk, but I particularly like that remark you made towards the end.
Thank you, Bernard. I don't know whether you want to say anything about that or just take that as a comment, Bob.
I never question any compliments like that.
Right. Okay.
I agree.
Excellent. And incidentally, Stephen Hawking was Bernard's PhD supervisor.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Well, I'm sorry I had to refer to him.
No, that's fine. So Steve wouldn't be pleased to hear me saying I sided with Hesse rather than Hawking, but
absolutely.
Well, Stephen probably didn't hear the remark.
Well, did you?
Right. Well, that raises another issue. Sigmar, how lovely to see you.
Yes, right. We'll talk about similar topic, even though with a different aspect. I came in a couple of minutes late, so I'm not sure whether Robert had its own near-death experience, but I became aware in that comparison of that research. I had a near-death experience, and I also have mystical experiences. And what Angus just mentioned, I also had psychedelic experience. And they all three have a very different field experience. So, and the questionnaires that coming, they are true about timelessness, affective peace, transcendent oneness, but nevertheless, I felt never addressed when the topic of NDE was coming in here. And I remember Congress we had with Erwin Laszlo, where I also presented with Pim van Lommel and Raymond Moody and so on. And Raymond talked to me that he was trying to invent a nonsense language for after near-death experiences, so that because as soon we come to the rational mind, we fade out of that experience. All these have been difficult to differentiate, but I know that mystical experience and psychedelic experience are more in my present adult state of consciousness that I can formulate, whereas a near-death experience, maybe because I had it as a child, it's very different to bring that into intellectual parameter. I mean, I did some research in infrared analysis and biophotonics, and it's the same what Angus said. We always have to be wary about what the interpretation is and how we try to prove our own experiences. And at the same time, of course, as Robert says, find similarities, but not equivalence.
Yeah.
So
Thank you very much.
Yeah. So that's the main thing. There are different fields of experiences.
Bob?
Well, I think you got a good point, and I think that might be an indication of maybe there should be research done on what I had observed in those 3 people that I just taught sensory prayer to.
Mhm.
And then they had a SCE in remembrance of their NDE. And I would love to do that study because that would address, I think it would address your issue.
Yeah.
And I think it'd be a fascinating study because it didn't happen just by accident. I mean, there was clearly, they relived it and they described it, what they went through. And I was amazed. To answer your question, yeah, I did not have a near-death experience myself, but I did have a mystical experience, an SCE.
Yeah.
And so I think like a lot of us here, I would bet that there's a much higher percentage of people that have had these kinds of experiences than in the general public. That's why you're all here. That's why we're here. Okay.
Yeah.
So that creates the incentive. Because I know it was real. You know?
Maybe I can make a short comment to that. What was also missing in the whole interpretation, that word love didn't come up. So I will attend to that in my lecture then. You know.
Peter.
Bob, thank you so much for that. And I am very supportive of a lot of the comments that I've made, but also very supportive of your work because it has to begin somewhere. And as you said, pointed out yourself, the sample size is very small. You talked about near-death experiences, but they aren't holistic things. What I'd like to know is what sort of near-death experiences they were. They're quite, you can have near-death experiences from a fear-death experience. There's obviously something which is quite different. You can have a transcendent experiences which goes into the same phenomena as near-death experiences, and they are quite different. And one of the reasons why we did all our work on cardiac arrests, because that was the only one where we felt that we knew, in fact, what the brain states were at the time of the experience. And so there was some equivalence in the others who don't. So that's my first point, my first set of points. But I want to now go on to the much more positive side. And I think this is very exciting because we're coming now down to what death actually is and the fine-grained nature of death. Because what has become apparent is that, in fact, death is not a contraction and a writing out, it is an expansion of consciousness. And it looks as if many near-death people, many dying people become non-dual. In other words, their egoic structures are destroyed by the dying process and they become non-dual. And then they have very similar mystical experiences which you were describing. And I think that to be able to get these two forms of experience together is very good. Can we say more than that? Yes, I think we can, because you talked about fear-death experiences. You talked about negative near-death experiences. And you talked about the the leaving of this nice heavenly realm and coming back into life again as being difficult. In fact, in the experiences we've had where people have gone into this alternate reality, which is love and light, and then come back again, they don't actually mind it. You wouldn't expect to get a strong negative memory for this. So in some ways, the leaving of the love and the light isn't quite as traumatic, but it may be because the dying people know they're going there anyway. And indeed, seems to be a lot of guidance at that time with spiritual beings talking to them and dead relatives talking to them and saying that they'll be there to carry them through it. So congratulations on a very nice early study. A lot of flaws in it, but some very nice things coming out of it. So have I got a question? Yes. The question is, what were your near-death experiences? Were they all the same? Were they different? That's a good question.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. Bob?
There are two ways of looking at their experience. One was a gradation scale to show that they had these same attributes, and so they shared that. In one case, that subject changed his mind and came full circle and changed his mind on the gradation scale he took in the beginning. So the only way we can figure this, and there is no way of knowing, but it's explainable by this transition through a door and you're getting on a better side. Who knows? Who knows? Then as far as the types of deaths they went through, that on that table, most of them were cardiac arrests, but the table gave other reasons why they were dying. So the medical record of them and what they died of is there, but it doesn't help us with what the actual transition was. We don't know. The only reason that the only conclusion I can draw from it at this stage is that because there is some commonality with pleasant experiences, why not use this to teach not just students in school, but in palliative care? To me, that's where the first application should be. Teach them centering prayer, teach them that's not just centering prayer, but if you could teach them Kabbalah, you can teach them Sufism, but they all are doing the same thing because it's all in that silence. There's no dogma. So it's pretty easy to pull off. It really can do it. I don't know if I answered the question, but
in fact, this very point came up in our breakout room with Peter. The idea that of teaching centering prayer and of spiritual practices that can help people in hospices. I think people on the call, if you're not familiar with the work of Jeffrey Martin, I think you'll find this very interesting. Peter put me onto this, and you'll see there's a review of his book in the current issue, and he describes various what he calls locations beyond on a spectrum of consciousness and where you can move between them, but you have a different sense of ego, different sense of feelings depending on where you are. I'm going to take this last question, which is a detailed one from the chat here, from Paul. It seems to me that the big challenge for this kind of study is the difference between a deep mystical experience and memories of that experience, which are likely to be a poor reflection of the experience itself. Mystical experiences are of a different order, barely captured by memories, which you said yourself, in fact. You acknowledge this potential problem, but how to get round it? I wonder how your results compare with the psychedelic brain scanning research, which utilizes the experiences themselves. How about that, Bob?
Now, psychedelic, you mean drugs? Is that what you're talking about?
Yes, no, but I think the point, the more important point is the difference between the experience and the memory of it.
Oh, yeah. Well, let me tell you how this research was born. Suddenly, I made the connection. So I go to Calixto Machado, and I said, You've got people that told you about near-death experiences. He says, yeah. I said, and you've got brain scans with one of those people? And he said, well, I don't know that those scans were at the moment they were having their near-death experience. I said to him, well, it doesn't matter. Look for the patterns. Maybe there's a pattern there. Then he launched into this memory issue. And I honestly, not being a neuroscientist, didn't believe him. But he kept insisting, yeah, it's not going to duplicate it, but it's pretty darn close. It's the basis of PTSD. Suddenly the brain goes back in time and has that experience again. And in the case of PTSD, I taught it to 10 people. One guy, 3 months later, out the breakout room, we talked about it. I said, how's it going? He said, well, not too good. I said, what happened? He said, well, during the prayer, I realized what really happened to me in Vietnam. I said, well, what did you do? He said, I ever so gently let it go and return to God. That's the unloading of the unconscious. I told that to the head of the psychiatric department at Baylor. He's now at the Menninger Clinic here in Houston. We got the largest medical center in the world here. His eyes popped out. He said, we don't know how to treat PTSD. We've got floors of patients at the VA hospital. So there's another application. And I had put a research program together for a guy at the VA, but he got shipped off. And so I've got the project ready, but I don't have the access. I'm sorry if I blow you in.
No, well, thank you very much, Bob. Well, I can tell from, we have almost a record number of questions this evening. Some evenings we don't have many questions at all. And so your talk has stimulated a lot of thought. And what I've been struck by as well is the quality of what's been going on in the chat, which you won't have been able to to cover yourself. But we will send you that,
Okay.
so that you will see the sort of things that people were talking about, and also giving references to one or two papers, and everybody commenting on each other. So thank you very much, everybody, for entering into the spirit of this and the process of exchange between us who are on the call, not just with Bob. And so, as I say, I'd like to thank you very much, Bob. Still the middle of the day for you there, for spending this time with us and for your comprehensive answers to questions. And I think everybody will be very interested to see how this research develops, because as you said yourself, it's in an early stage. It gives a few pointers, and there's an awful lot more that could be developed out of it. Yeah, thanks so much, Bob. And thank you very much, Andrew, for hosting us this evening, and to everybody for their questions and comments. So goodbye from me, and thank you so much for coming.